Putin's war machine continues to crack, increasingly though from the inside out. What a week it's been for the despot as a Russian minister, ironically the governor of Kursk, is fired and then hours later suspiciously found dead in a park. No windows possible there, despite the Kremlin still claiming it's suicide. Indeed, the real story is darker and unsurprisingly far more revealing. Meanwhile, Putin is losing control elsewhere, in the United States, as Trump seems to reinstate support for Ukraine once again, getting tired of Putin's attempted mind games, therefore pushing Russia to ramp up missile and drone production to terrifying new levels, with Ukraine warning it may soon face over 1,000 aerial threats every single night. So what does it mean when both your inner circle but also your broader context is seemingly getting worse? In this video, I want to break down exactly what could be happening within Putin's inner circle, the elites of Russia, and the growing sense, both in Moscow and abroad, that his regime really is on its last footing, that it really is no longer sustainable.
This is The Global Gambit.
How you going? Welcome to the channel where we increasingly are in disbelief at the rate at which cracks are widening in Russia's power structure and Putin's seemingly impervious position. Consider it for a minute. It was a Monday morning like no other, at least in Putin's Russia. Putin sacked his transport minister, Roman Starovyot, once governor of the infamous Kursk region, that border zone where, almost a year ago to the day, Ukraine launched an incredible counteroffensive into an area that hadn't been invaded since the Second World War. Yet, by the afternoon of this Monday just gone, Starovyot was no longer with us, found with a gunshot wound to his head in a Tesla west of Moscow. Not a building, not a shuttered window inside. The Kremlin, though, maintains it was suicide. A pistol beside him, no signs of foul play. But in Russia, and in Putin's inner circle, the silence speaks volumes. State television, the primary opinion-shaping tool of the Kremlin, has barely mentioned it, as it really does, with anything that may well make the despot and his regime look slightly awkward or weak. Just 18 seconds airtime. That was it. Compare that to the hours they'll spend talking about the NATO threats or Ukrainian drones, despite, because of Putin's actions, increasing the border with Finland and forcing it to join NATO, therefore expanding Russia's ultimate borderline with NATO. And all this because what happened to Starov was not just shocking, it was politically radioactive. Now, to understand where we are, you have to understand the context. Starovyot wasn't just any minister. He oversaw the fortification, or supposedly, of Russia's western border, a project meant to keep Ukrainian forces out of Kursk entirely, and it failed. Ukrainian troops breached those defences. Parts of Kursk were under Ukrainian control for 6 months. Remnants of it still is. Now Starovyot's successor and his deputies have been arrested for what some claim to be an embezzlement of over 1 billion rubles, roughly $12 million, meant for those border forces. Starovyot himself was reportedly next in line for prosecution, and he knew what that meant. In today's Russia, a criminal case isn't a legal one. It's a death sentence in slow motion for you, your reputation, and often your extended family. As one analyst has put it, there's no way out. Think 1937 Stalin, or as you may have known them, the Great Purges. Indeed, this is the first suicide, or supposedly suicide, of a Russian federal minister in over 30 years, since the Soviet Union. And that fact alone is damning. It suggests something unequivocally is shifting. The myth of Putin's system as ruthless but stable no longer holds. Fear, paranoia, and desperation are really creeping, not into the general population, not into the media, but into the elites, into the upper ranks, and therefore closer than ever before to President Putin. One tabloid even wrote, quote, "There is no more upward mobility, even downward mobility ends in death. Translation: you can no longer rise through the system, and if you fall, it might well kill you. And while Russian elites took note, or the public likely missed it, because the Kremlin deliberately buried the story. As always, you must control the narrative to contain the damage. But the real message was received by those inside the system, loud and clear, and very much not welcomed. And then you have to consider the trump card. Because if Putin was hoping to, say, offset his domestic instability with a friendlier White House, he may have to think again. He may have overplayed his hand, playing for time. Indeed, Trump, once hailed by Russian media as a misunderstood realist, has seemingly had enough once and for all himself. We have to keep in mind that Trump is very erratic and can go back and forth. But in recent weeks, he has called out Putin more directly than ever. We get a lot of bullshit thrown at us by Putin, he said to reporters. He's very nice, but it turns out to be meaningless. Trump seems to be waking up, and that is illustrated by his restoration of aid to Ukraine, despite the Pentagon pausing it just a couple of days ago. And that came also earlier in the week, when Trump made threats of tariffs to the BRICS countries meeting this week, which included Russia, and fuming that no progress had been made in peace talks over Ukraine. So suddenly Moscow's optimism and position leverage is gone. Russian papers are now mocking Trump very openly for his volatility, questioning his, quote, geopolitical achievements, and hinting he may no longer be worth even betting on. And Trump himself? Well, he's now treating Putin less like an idol, less like a strongman ally, and more simply like a negotiating obstacle. At the end of the day, Trump wants a deal, but if Putin's going to be the bigger impediment than Zelensky, well, then he will become his main adversary. And so as the Kremlin bleeds internally and loses its leverage abroad, it has to look elsewhere. In this case, its factories, which are doing something else entirely. Scaling up. New reports suggest Russia may soon be capable of launching over 1,000 drones and missiles in a single night. Former Ukrainian intelligence officers emphasize that if Ukraine doesn't find solutions soon, 2025 could bring overwhelming destruction. Many of these drones, which, well, inspired and learnt from their Iranian counterparts, are basic, not high-tech, and, well, if sent in swarms, can simply overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses because of how cheap and fast they are to produce. As another expert has put it, this isn't as much a war of attrition as it is a war of resources. Russia simplifies its missile production, opting instead for mass production of these modified drones. The result? To quote Stalin, quantity is quality. More drones per wave means more strain on Ukraine. As Patriot batteries are depleted, Ukraine is forced to use costly jets and air-to-air missiles to simply shoot down what are effectively flying lawnmowers. The goal here, well, to bleed the West's supply and support slowly, to turn up the pressure on that already existing war fatigue, drain Kyiv's options, and make the war simply unaffordable. That's why Zelensky has been pleading for broader air defense systems, not merely Patriots. And this week, the UK pledging another 5,000 new air defense missiles. But it's a drop in the bucket. And the meetings, as we see ongoing in Rome, mean just how much Ukraine needs volume, because Russia already has it and is only increasing it. So let's connect the dots at this point. At home, Putin is facing this internal struggle. Ministers under investigation, regional failures, elite suicides, and a silent press trying to contain it all. Abroad, he's now lost his best leverage. Trump's unpredictability is no longer a wildcard in his favour, much to arguably his own doing. In fact, it's starting to expose just how little leverage Putin actually has. Even Trump's former envoy to Moscow, Steve Witkoff, who once brought gifts from Putin back to the White House, hasn't visited for ages at this point. Bilateral diplomacy is effectively over, and the ceasefire talks have never really gotten off the ground. And Russia, sensing it might be losing its bargaining chip, is starting to panic. The Kremlin wanted Trump to hand them Ukraine on a silver platter, but Trump's signals are mixed. His priorities are shifting, The isolation is growing, and seemingly he seems to be pivoting towards Ukraine once more. The NATO summit, as we covered in the past couple of weeks, only adding to that. So where does this leave you if you are Vladimir Putin? Here's the brutal truth in that case, that the regime is entering a phase of what some could argue is self-cannibalization. Officials are being purged. Corruption is no longer protected, it's weaponized. And the supposed benefits of loyalty are being replaced by the constant fear of betrayal, exposure, or prosecution. This is the same pattern we've seen in other authoritarian systems under pressure. When power becomes unsustainable, it doesn't collapse outward. It collapses inward first. And when your own ministers start, apparently killing themselves in Teslas on the edge of Moscow, something inside the system really has already broken. Vladimir Putin, though, may well survive this moment. He survived worse, or seemingly even attempted mutinies. But that doesn't mean his system will. The suicide of a minister, the breakdown of Russian Trump fantasy land, the mass production of these drones, and the growing disconnect between a state and the elite and the realities and propaganda, they all point to one thing: a regime that is really running out of road, running out of options. It is increasingly resorting to the most extreme, which, one questions how long Putin's broader circle will be willing to put up with that. And what happens when that fear that keeps the system in place starts turning on itself? Let me know in the comments your thoughts. Is this Putin's grip breaking, or is it just another controlled purge disguised as chaos? Now, if you don't know me, my name is Pyotr, and I do have a background from Russia, but also England. So on this channel, I try to bring together this rather unique blend of someone who's been brought up predominantly in the West, but has strong influences from the Slavic and specifically Russian spheres of the world. I have studied and worked across both these countries, as well as in the UN and the World Bank, and I hope to bring a different perspective to what's going on, including with the people that I interview, from diplomats to policymakers to journalists and academics. And if that appeals to you, then do consider subscribing and supporting the channel. But until next time, thanks all very much for watching, and watch this one below to understand how Russia may have just lost out in the South Caucasus. Take care.